Faina from, who is the Canadian Technical Advisor. I hope I got that right. Correct? Correct. On the issue of the role of sustainable communities in addressing climate change. And then later in the day, we had, of course, responses from all the discussions throughout the day. And finally, we had recap from our very able rapporteur, Ms. Irene. And I would still like, since it's on the program today, that we're supposed to recap on what happened yesterday, and for the benefit of all those who have just come in today, maybe hear from some participants from the community in Geita say something. And I said I'll go every table to like hear from the participants themselves, not from the moderator, on what were the key takeaways that they had from yesterday's day of discussion. Karibu.
Habarini za asubuhi wapendwa. Kwa ambao hawakuwepo jana, naitwa Dorothea Ernest Shigi, diwani halmashauri ya wilaya ya Geita. Kutokana na jana nilivyoona, nimeona wanawake ni muhimu zaidi kulingana na uwezeshwaji ili kuweza kushiriki vizuri. Pia niombe tu kwamba waheshimiwa madiwani waweze kupewa nafasi zaidi kwa sababu ya kueneza habari hizi. Tunashauri, tunajenga kwa kuhusisha wakina mama wenzetu ili tuweze kuwaweka sawa katika ushiriki wa uchimbaji na kuwahamasisha. Maana tuna nafasi hii kubwa ya kuweza kushiriki nao. Asanteni.
Asante, Mheshimiwa Diwani. From this table, anyone wants to give a brief recap?
Asante. Asante. Yalizungumzwa mambo mengi sana mazuri jana. Kubwa ambalo kwenye meza hii tunalikumbuka ni kuendelea kuwashirikisha wanawake hasa katika extractive industries, kwa maana kwamba walisahaulika kwa muda mrefu na wanapitia changamoto nyingi ikiwemo kukosa mitaji, kujishughulisha na shughuli hizo ambazo zina athari, kwa mfano kushika mercury kwa sababu ya kutokuwa na elimu ya kutosha, kukosa vifaa vya uchimbaji kama PPEs na vitu kama hivyo. Hao ni machache ambayo tuliyasikiliza jana.
Asante. I also recall Madam Elizabeth speaking passionately about every citizen's role, the citizens that are involved in the extractive industry to participate in CSR, right? I remember you're very passionate about that, that even the smallest miner has a duty to contribute to CSR activities in the area that they are doing their activity, the mining activity. Karibu.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shamsa Diwani. I would like to say that I'm happy to hear how this project of TLS and SEED went. I believe everybody can be sure that the project went well. And I believe maybe Canadian government will appreciate for this and the project will be continued. But also, I can see Stamico, they are here. And I know it's their duty to look for small-scale miners, artisanal and small-scale miners. So I think Stamico, they should work very close with TLS. And in case SEED will not continue with this project, also Stamico should see how they can help this women development and small-scale miners. And it's not for Geita or Lake Zone only. It's for all Tanzania. They can go slowly, and everyone in mining areas can benefit this opportunity. So I just wanted to say that STAMICO should be very close with TLS and see how they can help and work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That calls to mind what Ms. Jennifer had said yesterday about the possible extension of this project to possibly maximum 9 months. And I also recall we had Mr. Luende here yesterday who was very passionate on the issue of context, right? He gave his presentation during the panel on, you know, how we must be mindful of cultural context in terms of how we define sustainable communities, how we spread awareness on the issue of climate change and the like. I remember Madam from STAMICO saying they work very closely with women miners in the areas of health and safety, right? Okay, and environment protection. And to this table, anyone would like to say something? Recap from yesterday? I recall you had a question.
Yes, asante. Jana nilitoka na kitu kimoja kuhusu renewable energy. Ili kuzuia climate change, naomba tujikite kwenye renewable energies. Yeah. That's all.
Thank you very much. He has reminded us about renewable energy. And I remember a new term that I learned yesterday from Ms. Selina Lee's Anderson presentation. Smart mining, something like that?
Climate smart.
Climate smart mining. That's a new term that we learned also yesterday while setting the center stage on the issue of climate change. Okay, all new faces we have Barak. Very passionate speaker. Karim.
Thank you. Among other things, we discussed different national priorities on the matter of the climate change in Tanzania, and we saw that we have in place different policies and legislation regarding to climate change. But the question was do we have our sustainable community in Tanzania, and what are we as a Tanzanian define the sustainable community? It was a question which was posed by Mr. Isakwisa, and we need to digest on that based into the Ruhende context, what do we mean about sustainable community. Then one thing I learned is that the mining sector globally contributes 4 to 7% of greenhouse emissions, so we need to see how we can have the modern technologies and science which we employ in mining sector so that we can reduce emission.
Thank you, Baraka. But I also recall that you and I had a discussion on the issue of, we were actually a bit surprised on non-existence of the climate change policy in Tanzania. And you were telling me in detail how maybe Kenya already has the law, and we recall the discussion from the engineer that one of the priorities with the EAC right now is to have a regional legislation for climate change protection. But you also pointed out, and I was really impressed that you knew that, that we hardly have any detailed discussion in our legislation in Tanzania regarding climate change. And in the Mining Act, reference to climate and environmental protection is referred to the Environment Management Act, right? We had that discussion as well. Thank you for that. Karibu, Kwaresma. Karibu.
Asante. Mimi nilichojifunza jana kwamba pamoja na sheria kuwepo nyingi kuhusiana na sekta ya uziduaji, lakini wananchi wengi wanakuwa hawafahamu, kwa hiyo wanahitaji elimu ili waweze kufahamu kinachoendelea kwenye sekta ya uziduaji. Sababu baada ya huu mradi ilipotolewa elimu, naona wanawake wengi wamezinduka. Kwa hiyo ndio nilichojifunza.
Asante sana. That's very important point that we were all impressed by how the grassroots community representatives expressed how empowered they felt with the project. And Jennifer mapped that with the situation in Kenya and how empowered the women were also there. There was also a call from Jennifer to utilize the fund that is available under SIRD for the already empowered women in Tanzania to actually use the power that they have right now to take action in the areas that are relevant, like environmental protection and the likes. I hope the grassroots communities and the women and Mheshimiwa Diwani make use of that point, that there is some funding that needs to be utilized to help the women now take action to empower others on areas that they are already empowered in terms of what has been done in the context of the SIRD project. Anyone? Karibu, madam.
Thank you. The area of interest for me yesterday was energy as a vehicle towards the climate change issues, and whether we must have a climate change policy or not. To me, documentation is not much. It's not doing much if we don't have a strategy for implementing that policy. Because as far as energy is concerned, the energy policy stated clear about energy mix. Renewable is included. Only that we define a priority now, as the means that with priority is water, and then natural gas. Renewable take the third place. And again, when talking about moving to renewable, what we are looking is about energy cost per unit. If you compare hydro and the renewable, and the initial costs and the amount of energy which you are going to get from renewable, can you use renewable energy as base load for industries? The answer is no. Because as you see for solar, we just use for small items like lightning or what, but if you have a refrigerator which is using solar and then it's very hot, my friend, you are going to throw all your things because it will never go. We take it as the alternative. If I have this one electricity from Tanzania, which already generated, and the one who is using solar, I'm more comfortable than that. And if you are going to use the industries, then coal or hydro or what can be used as baseload, but not renewable. And if you have a grid, in order to be sustainable, you are allowed to put only 20% to the grid. The 100% has to come from other sources. So when you look at the third, not third world, but the countries which are still struggling for power for light, and then we switch to electricity cars, it's a long journey. What is important is the changes has to start from the individuals. Whatever we can do to protect that climate, we also advocate for changing from to a modern energy. Maybe if you are using charcoal, you can use modified charcoal at that small scale. But moving as the world going, that is a big discussion on its own. So to me, it's a change from individual. And then if you have documents, our policies are very nice, our laws are very nice, but implementations, enforcement, monitoring and evaluation, does it work? So you have a climate policy, but then if you are doing nothing, if it's not in the budget, how are you going to do it? Maybe alternative way is to streamline the climate change to already existing things, so that you can have budget to implement at least something is better than nothing. We can reduce small, but if you have a policy through financing by Canadian or whatever partner, then after policy, what next? You need law, regulations, rules, guidelines. So we end up having a document which is not doable. But starting from today, maybe from here, we have to ask ourselves from a family level, what do we do to save that climate or to save the environment so that the climate will be good for all of us. That is what I take from yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very complex presentation. I appreciate that. But it also reminds me of Miss Laura's presentation yesterday, which invoked the discussion on regulation and how do you legislate? How do you create regulations? Is it a top, bottom initiative or bottom up strategy that you use to create frameworks for developing the necessary policies to address the issues of, among others, climate change, and then capturing the issue of renewable energy as you have presented it.
Hello. Small point in terms of big picture.
Can you use your mic on the table, please?
Yes, she's there. They're assisting me to make it closer. Good morning.
1 minute, please.
Yeah, for sure. I think listening from yesterday's conversation, discussion, we remain with a challenge of consolidating efforts, success of the previous project, and embrace the new vision that we have in terms of going towards a climate change path. So we are having two pictures at the same time. We have the embracing of the success that we have seen. The consolidation of it should be something you can take on. At the same time, we want to go with the path in terms of climate change and whatever. Thank you.
Thank you very much for looping that and putting it all in context. Anybody would like to say something from this table? I hope I'm not putting you in a spot.
Good morning.
Good morning, Joe.
I don't mind being put on the spot today. I think one of the important things we heard about this morning from some of the other people who are speaking is the word context, and I think that's very important, and we can't lose sight of that. And there's context not only in terms of what is happening here on the ground, context at the policy level and legislation, and also in terms of the program and what the CERT program is able to offer and the priorities that the program itself does not set, but some of those priorities are set by the principal funder, which is the Department of Global Affairs Canada. So we try to carry this out in all of those contexts, and with an objective of improving the situation in terms of sustainable extractive resource development here and in the other East African countries, with emphasis on communities and women.
Thank you very much for that. Much obliged. Anybody would like to say something on this table? Please, I give precedence to you, Mwalimu. If there's something you would like to say. I hope I'm not putting you in a spot. Karibu.
Thank you. Good morning. I think the discussion is very fruitful and engaging. A couple of things I maybe missed out because I left. I think we agreed that there is no recognition of artisanal miners in the law in terms of them being given the opportunity. The government's intention, if you look at the policy, it's to change the artisanal miners into small-scale miners, and it's from them that the government will make an initiative of changing them. So we have to have that in mind throughout. The idea of renewable energy, and maybe I should make this quite clear. We must go with the times. Things are developing across the globe in terms of environment. The issue of renewable energy in Tanzania should be distinguished between, we must make the distinction between renewable energy and alternative energy. Kwa Kiswahili, nishati jadidifu na nishati mbadala. If you don't get that distinction, we'll be going somewhere that's not proper. So if you're talking about renewable energy, we have to go with the trend in terms of moving to climate change. The issue of alternative energy, that could be discussed. So if the resources we have today, We also have to think about other resources. And with time, that can also keep changing. So I think we should engage in the discussion rather than let it disappear. Thank you so much for now.
Thank you very much. Asante sana mwalimu. That is very valid observation. Now, without further discussion and to keep time, may I now please proceed to session 2 for today, which is a whole hour of discussion through the panelists on sustainable resource development policies and regulation to address climate change. And the panelists for this topic will be the national expert, mwalimu wetu Professor Hamoud Ismail Majamba. Please may you take the floor. And then we also have Dr. Rukonge Sospita Muhongo. He joined us today. He was not there yesterday. He is extractive industry sector representative, energy and extractive industry. Okay. Karib sana. Please give him a round of applause. Then we will have representative from the legal department, vice president office, council is Akwisa Lamek Mwamukomba. Karibu. Two last panelists, but not the least important. Very important, actually, all the way from Canada. We have John Stefaniuk. Did I pronounce that right? Karibu, please take the floor. And Miss Selina Lee Anderson. And all of you today are invited to lead the discussion as noted on the agenda, considering climate change related policies and strategies in the country. I believe for Canada you'll share your experience from that side through a gendered lens. And each one of you will have about 7 minutes. I've added today. That's great. To give your presentation on the subject. May I please start with Professor Majamba. Karibu.
Good morning once again. I'm aware that we have translators. I can use either language. That is English or Swahili. And I believe, oh, I'm sorry, you guys don't have your, can you get them? I'll be doing a combination of both. Na nitatumia Kiswahili zaidi. So having said that, I will switch kwenye mada yangu. Nimeambiwa dakika 7 nizungumzie masuala ya utawala, systems of utawala na namna mifumo ya utawala Tanzania kwenye masuala ya mabadiliko ya tabia nchi, ukiangalia sera na mipango mingine ya serikali katika kufanya maamuzi. Sasa kwa ufupi nitazungumzia tu kwamba utawala, kuzungumzia mifumo ya utawala lazima uzungumzie masuala ya utawala bora. Utawala bora sio bora utawala. Kwa hiyo tuzingatie kwanza. Kwa hiyo katika utawala bora unajikita kwenye masuala yafuatayo. Ni mengi lakini ya msingi ni yafuatayo. Utii wa sheria bila shuruti, lakini pia utawala wa sheria, rule of law, masuala ya haki za binadamu, uwazi katika kufanya maamuzi transparency, uwakilishwaji katika masuala ya muhimu yanayohusu utawala wa nchi. Taarifa, kila mtu awe na uhuru wa kupata taarifa na uhuru wa kujieleza. Sasa hayo tu ni baadhi ya mambo ambayo ni muhimu sana katika mfumo wa utawala na utawala bora. Sasa ukichukulia upande wa utawala katika nchi ya Tanzania, mfumo wa utawala umejikita katika sehemu kuu ambazo nafikiri mnazifahamu. Nitakukumbusha tu kwamba kuna serikali kuu, central government, kuna serikali ya mkoa, kuna serikali ya, kama unaposhuka chini mpaka unafika ngazi ya mwisho, sisi wengine tunasema chini, yani mpaka nyumbani kwako. Unatoka kwenye ward level, unakwenda kwenye mtaa, kutoka kwenye nyumbani. Kwa hiyo huo ndio mfumo uliopo katika masuala ya utawala. Sasa katika hayo unaangalia zile nilizozungumzia, rule of law, masuala ya haki za binadamu, uwazi na usawa na kila kitu. Unajiuliza sasa kwenye sera zetu ambazo jana ndugu yangu Isabisa alizungumzia, nafikiri umezipata, sitazirudia tena, za msingi zile. Ukiangalia sera ya masuala ya mabadiliko ya tabia ardhi, tabia nchi, utakuta nayo imejikita katika maeneo tofauti. Sera yenyewe, mipango iliyopo, na ukiangalia sheria sasa, utazikuta pia sheria hizi zipo, pamoja na kwamba tulisema jana kwamba hakuna sheria moja kwa mfumo kwa maana ya framework law, lakini kuna vipengele kwenye sheria ya mazingira, sheria nyingine, ukiangalia pia sheria ya misitu, sheria ya uvuvi na mingine mingi. Kuna masuala ya tabia nchi yamejikita kule ndani. Changamoto ulionayo ni kwamba ziko sehemu tofauti. Sasa kwenye swala la uwakilishaji au uwakilishaji wa wanawake na mfumo wa kuongeza uwezo wa wanawake kuweza kufanya maamuzi, utakuta kwenye sera hizi na sheria hizi tumeweka mifumo ya vyombo vya utawala, kwenye advisory boards, kwenye councils na baadhi yao. Kwa ukiangalia maeneo mengi utakuta hii mifumo ipo. Kwa hiyo wanawake kuna sheria na sera zinasema kwamba katika maamuzi yafuatayo, vyombo vinafanya maamuzi, kutakuwa na uwakilishi wa wanawake. Sasa cha msingi ni kujiuliza kama huu uwakilishi huu, aina uwakilishi huu katika utawala bora unajitosheleza. Na utagundua, mimi nishawahi kufanya utafiti, nafikiri pepa yangu moja tulishasambaza, tuambieni ipi, nikagundua kwamba unakuta kwenye mifumo hii tuliyoweka ni ile tu kwa ndio kweli ni kwamba tumepachika tu kwamba kutakuwepo na uwakilishi wa kina mama kwenye mifumo ifuatayo. Anasema angalau 2% au angalau 2, lakini wengine wote ni dume. Anasema angalau 2. Sasa angalau 2, sasa katika mfumo huo wa maamuzi umewajengea uwezo, umeweza kuhakikisha kwamba yote tuliyozungumza pale wanaweza kupata taarifa na mengine mengi. Unakuta katika mfumo huo kwenye baadhi ya sheria, na nitakuchukua mfano mmoja kuonyesha hatari zake. Sheria ya ardhi ya vijiji, umefahamu? Kwenye masuala ya ile baraza la usuluhishi, village council, anasema kutakuwa na angalau idadi ya wanawake imetajwa, umefahamu? Baraka unaijua ulikuwa unafundisha, unaijua na kwa resma unazijua kwamba kuna idadi ya wanawake, idadi fulani, bila idadi hiyo maamuzi ya baraza ni batili. Umeona jamani? Kwa hiyo ilikuwa ni moja hapo. Na ukiangalia kwenye masuala ya ardhi inazungumzia masuala ya changamoto za mabadiliko ya tabia nchi. Lakini changamoto iliyopo hapo kwamba sasa ukiangalia upande mwingine, unaposema wanawake watakuwa idadi fulani, hivi kikatokea wote wakawa wanawake. Au unapozungumzia swala hilo, ndio unaporudi kwenye eneo ambalo tulizungumzia pale katika kujadili masuala haya kwenye mfumo wa nchi ya Tanzania, in the context of the Tanzanian country. Tujikite kwenye vitu vifuatavyo, nafikiri tunafahamu. Tuangalie uhalisia. kwenye masuala ya siasa, as political, masuala ya jamii, social, masuala ya uchumi, economic, lakini pia cha msingi masuala ya mila na tamaduni, cultural considerations. Tukienda kupa kama tulivyosikia jana, tuambiwa kwamba wakina dada kule kina mama bali Geita kule walianza kufanya mfumo, wakaanza kujitegemea, wakaanza kwenda wabeba watoto, wakirudi nyumbani wanakuta mume hayupo. Anauliza, kwa hiyo unapofanya masuala hayo ya unajikita katika kufanya haya, tuangalie pia tujikite katika kuhakikisha kwamba wale ambao mifumo yao na mindset zao lazima tubadilishe. Kwa hiyo huwezi kuwapa nguvu sana kina mama au kuwaelekeza ya kufanya katika mfumo wa utawala bora bila kuhakikisha kwamba na wale ambao wanaweza kukwamisha jitihada hizo nao unawawezesha, kwa maana ya kwamba kwenye masuala ya tamaduni waelewe lengo ni zuri, kusaidiana. Tamaduni za Kiafrika na za Tanzania zinataka kusaidiana, lakini ikionekana una impose, unakuwa na negative perception, watakataa na tutakwama. Kwa hiyo kwa ujumla wake, mimi nadhani kwa kumalizia, labda muda wangu kama bado upo, kwamba kuna umuhimu wa kuendelea kujadili mambo haya katika kujikita katika uhalisia. Tusiruke tu. Natawaambieni baadhi ya tamaduni na mila ni desturi za kwetu. Tukianza kuchanganya na mengine, wale kule nyumbani au kule kijijini wataanza kujiuliza maswali mengi. Sisi tulifanya utafiti huko Rufiji katika masuala ya mabaraza ya ardhi. Tukagundua kwenye baadhi ya mashauri usuluhishi kwenye village councils, kwenye mikoa ya pwani, coastal areas, utamaduni, labda kwa sababu ya dini na desturi nyingine, wanawake hawawezi kukaa na wanaume kufanya maamuzi. Kwa hiyo kule Kuranga, maeneo ya Rufiji kule ndani kule, tukakuta kwamba unauliza kina mama, kwa nini hapo kwenye vikao hairuhusiwi? Sema lakini sheria inasema. Wanasema ni sheria yenu. Hiyo ni sheria mliyotunganyie. Wako na consultation wakina mama wenyewe. Kwa maamuzi mengi katika maeneo hayo ni batili. Lakini utafanyaje? Inabidi tu jaribu kuongea. Wale wanakwenda kule wakirudi nyumbani wana shida. Sasa unavunja misingi ya familia kwa kujaribu kufanya maamuzi ambayo ni magumu. Kwa hiyo kuna umuhimu, tunachofanya ni vizuri, lakini twende polepole na tuangalie mila, desturi, siasa zetu na uchumi wetu. Kwa sasa hivi mimi naomba niishie hapo. Ningependa tu kusema labda kwenye mradi huu swala hili limekwenda vizuri, tumesikia mifano iliyotoa Geita ni vizuri sana, ni changamoto tumeiona. Maeneo mengine tutakwenda kule kwenye masuala ya tabia nchi. Kwenye tabia nchi hautajikita kwenye eneo moja kwenye extractives, tutakwenda nchi nzima ya Tanzania. Kwa hiyo tuangalie, tujifunze kwamba namna ya kuweza kupeleka ujumbe wetu ambao ni mzuri, kwa maana ya tuelewe wenzetu. Kingine tusisahau kwenye mambo ya tabia nchi, kuna baadhi ya mila na desturi na tabia za Watanzania. Sisi kwenye kitaalamu tunaziita indigenous knowledge. Kwa muda mrefu tumetumia hizi kufanya maamuzi kuhusu watapanda wapi, watapanda lini, watafanyaje. Katika kwenda kwa engage, tusije tukaonekana mila zao tunazipeka nje, tunaita za kwetu mpya, pamoja na kwamba tungependa kushirikisha wanawake kwenye masuala haya. Mimi nashukuru, naona amenifuata karibu huyu kwamba ninyamaze sasa hivi. Asanteni sana.
Thank you very much, Mwalimu, for that insightful presentation. I hear what you're saying. One, that governance systems exist. There was an issue of increasing the participation of women. You elaborated that there are given percentages that indicate that certain number of women should be involved, for example, in decision-making bodies. But what happens when it's all women? You have also advised, shall I say, cautioned, based on your experience and research, that whatever we are doing, it has to be the empowerment that we are doing, the inclusion that we are seeking in terms of empowering women should be inclusive and not leave behind the men who also are the supporting figures in the whole ecosystem, not only in the cultural, traditional environment of existence at family level, but also at the decision-making level, because if you are not mindful of the traditions, then you might come up with laws that are not enforceable. You have a good law, but you cannot make it work because you failed to embrace the context, the cultural context, and cultural considerations. Thank you for that. We will have responses also from and contributions from members on the floor. But right now, I'd like to invite Ms. Selina Lee to speak about ESG considerations for integrating conservation strategies into policy aimed at creating employment opportunities and reducing poverty in local communities. 5 minutes. Ms. Selina, maybe you can also react a little bit to what Professor Majamba has said. I know you being a woman coming from Canada and hearing all that from Professor. What is your take?
I mean, I think we have similar challenges in Canada to incorporate women into decision-making processes, and the governance piece remains an important one. And I think we are trying to have more measurable targets. I mean, it's one thing to talk about, including more women, and as well, because, Canada is a very culturally diverse country. We have a lot of minority groups who may not necessarily be represented at higher levels of government or management. And so there's an effort to, I think, acknowledge that a lot of these, whether it's public policy or private sector, need to reflect more of the Canadian sort of cultural landscape, if you will. And so I think there is an effort to, these are ongoing challenges, I think, that are not unique to Tanzania. And in Canada, we are also trying to take it to a level where we can measure our progress. And I think that's a very important piece of what I will speak a little bit about in terms of governance. And this is, building on some of the concepts I spoke about yesterday, especially around ESG. So there are a lot of, ESG is driving a lot of corporate policies. And I think these corporate policies will transform the way in which companies are interacting with the communities in which they operate. So we talk a lot about CSR, and I mentioned CSR and ESG are two different things. So CSR is, seeks to make business accountable for its activities, whereas ESG is sort of, you can consider it perhaps the next evolution of CSR. So it's environmental, social governance, which makes these efforts for business, making them accountable to make it measurable. So that you set targets and you can measure a company's performance as to whether they're actually achieving it. Because it's very nice to have vision statements and general commitments, but if you can't measure it, then you don't know how a company is doing in these areas. So just to kind of build on sort of ESG, what it is exactly. So when we're talking about ESG criteria, it's really a set of standards for companies' operations. And what it's useful for is for investors who are looking to screen potential investments. What they're looking at is material risks. So that can be environmental risks like climate change impacts to those operations. Risks in the social level for communities. If they're unhappy communities, is there a chance for social unrest if they don't maintain good relationships with the local stakeholders? as well as opportunities for growth, because there are opportunities, of course, in climate change, not only challenges. So the environmental piece is really how a company performs as a steward of nature. Social is how a company manages relationships with employees, suppliers, customers, and the communities in which they operate. And governance deals with the company's leadership, audits, internal controls, and shareholder relations. And this, for example, would include, for example, setting targets for the number of women that you have in senior management positions, as well as the boards of directors. So the challenge is, as I mentioned yesterday, is really to how do companies significantly increase production of, for example, strategic minerals while trying to meet these standards, which is to reduce their environmental footprint, to incorporate climate change considerations into your decision making, to incorporate a gendered approach to make sure that it's balanced in the organization, and also addressing social impacts in local communities. How do you bring capacity, training, education opportunities, and job opportunities to the local communities? So in the recent years, there's really been an acknowledgement of the need for transparency, accountability, and a set of consistent standards to measure corporate performance. So before, as I mentioned, under CSR, there tend to be kind of vague commitments to build communities and to invest in communities. So investors found it very difficult to quantify risks associated with operations and how to build those into transactional loan agreements and credit agreements with investors. So they were looking for a consistent set of standards that you can look across industries. So maybe an oil and gas project, of course, is going to be riskier than perhaps a mining project that has strategic minerals for future investments. So there's slowly a global standard that is emerging for ESG, and I think I'd like to put that on your radar. So one important piece, of course, of the environmental piece of ESG is climate change and climate change disclosure. Because a lot of resource companies operate in different parts of the world with different climate risks, there's been a push to have a disclosure standard so that there is information that is consistent for investors to look at to see which is a good investment. And in 2015, there was an initiative that is called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which was really an acknowledgement that there needed to be one standard for different industries, including the resource sector, for companies to disclose a standard set of climate change information. And this standard has really transformed the way in which companies are now required to disclose climate risk. So this is driving a lot of companies to look at across their supply chain to see what the climate risk is to their operations and to disclose those to investors. It started off really as a voluntary initiative, but now it is becoming increasingly mandatory. So this is something that Tanzania might consider incorporating into its laws as it develops its climate change regulations. The UK is the very first country that will make climate change disclosure mandatory by 2025. I think other countries will follow. And in other countries, for example, in Canada, companies that are listed on the stock exchange are required to, under securities laws, to disclose certain climate change risks. So, I want to put that on your radar as companies will be, moving towards this direction. The last piece I just wanted to flag for your, just put on your radar screen, is that as biodiversity. So biodiversity has been very hard to measure for similar reasons of climate change, because every geographical area has different flora, fauna, water, species, forestry. So it's been very difficult for investors to kind of look at biodiversity. So just as companies are trying to get comfortable with the climate disclosure risk, now investors are demanding that they cover a whole new range of issues related to biodiversity. So it's a whole new range of risk factors for investors to consider. So now there is a task force on nature-related financial disclosures, which just came out last year. And so, I expect that this will increasingly gain momentum, and investors will look at projects that protect biodiversity rather than overexploiting certain resource sectors. And so this is something that is still evolving in the Western markets. But I just wanted to put it on your radar screen as you are thinking about climate and the related piece of biodiversity. And there are opportunities, for capacity building, monitoring nature. In Canada, when we have, I work with a lot of resource companies who engage Indigenous communities, and they train their people, Indigenous communities, to have environmental monitors. So they'll monitor wildlife, they'll monitor forestry. So there'll be opportunities, I think, to build those skill sets. And I think on that note, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ms. Selina, for that enlightening presentation on the issue of ESG. ESG is the new CSR. I hope the participants are jotting their points in terms of what they want to contribute in terms of what is being discussed right now, climate change, sustainability, how we can make stakeholders in the mining industry comply, shall I say. We don't have a policy guiding climate change yet, but it will be interesting to hear from the stakeholders in here on their take on whether we have any measures at the moment that we can gauge as steps that the stakeholders in the mining industry are taking to address the issue of climate change. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Next in line will be Dr. Rukonge. Dr. Rukonge, I know you're going to talk about improving market access, financial services, to incentivize transition to a low carbon economy. I know that aspect already is the climate change aspect, right? And agricultural technologies, that also might touch climate change, and infrastructure to enhance the productivity of small farmers. If you can also respond to the previous two presenters, that would be great. You will have also 5 minutes.
I'll try. So thank you for having me. And I would like, as much as I would like to sound professional, but I think it's better if I explain it in the form of a story so that I can get to the points, arrive to the point that I expect to arrive to. Well, so first of all, as Professor Majamba mentioned earlier, I'm sorry I'm using English more comfortable. But as he mentioned on issues of governance, they're very pertinent and very constructive in the issues of climate change. And as she mentioned, my fellow panelists here, on the issues of ESG, ESG, even in the field of academia, is still a very new area, and a very green area that a lot of people are trying to understand what it means in sense of different aspects and different contexts within industry, within disciplines, and so forth. But going forward, the issues of climate change, I would like to explain it in a way that I understood it. When I started my research on natural resources, and I think as a young African academic, the main issue was how can Africans gain from their natural resources? That has always been the issue since time immemorial. How do we tap into our natural resources? And this starts from countries that are very rich in natural resources, from Tanzania to Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, and so forth, and South Africa, etc. So heading forward, when you go now and you start your research, in between your research, you come to realize that in academia, you have to go with the changing times, as Professor Majamba mentioned. And you come to realize that climate change is something that is gets more traffic and more traction than natural resources. So of course, my natural instinct as an African in Europe is, this is a neo-colonial tool that is trying to hold Africans behind, because maybe of the colonial times you have that victim mentality. But then you come to understand that, of which I'll drop down to agriculture, you come to understand that climate change touches every aspect of our lives. So for example, climate change dictates what we produce, how we produce it, what we use, and how we use it, how we move, and what we move in, and how we travel, how we make incomes, whatever we do in our lives, climate change touches it. For just as an example, if you enter, for example, Mlimani City Mall and you enter in all shops of clothing, they try to show you that those clothes were created sustainably, and that's because of climate change. Though the policies are not there, but in practice it's needed. So why should we tap into climate change as Africans and as Tanzanians? First of all is because we don't exist as an island, we exist in a global value chain, whereby the whole world is integrated into one when it comes to trade, commerce, and finance. So when we come to realize that the world exists as one, what we produce when we think of climate change, we think of it production in terms of subsistence and use, but not in terms of export and trade. So when we think of it in terms of export and trade, we come to realize we have to create things sustainably which are climate change cautious, so that they can be consumed by other countries, because their policies will only advocate for that. That type of creation, or that type of sustainability. So now when you trickle down to the issues of agriculture, the issue comes whereby agriculture is a facilitator of climate change, and again it's needed to sustainably hinder climate change. How does agriculture contribute to climate change, to the ramifications or the impacts of climate change? By using fertilizers like nitrous oxide, by using, it creates soil erosion, and especially like in livestock, poultry and livestock farming. So all these are facilitators of climate change. But again, we need food to eat, we need food to survive. And then again, we need food because in Africa and in Tanzania in particular, agriculture and small-scale agriculture is the biggest sector. As much as it's informal, but it's the biggest employer of the young people. So as I explained it as a story, when it comes to the issues of there are few employment opportunities, a lot of young graduates and mid-graduates and experts as well are transitioning from offices to the farming sector. So how do they enter into the agricultural sector? Well, there is this climate change issue, and there's an issue of tapping into markets that they want to produce to make a living. So now when they transition into that, that's why the whole issue of climate change created something called the energy transition, whereby we need to advocate moving from one source of fuel to some other sources of fuel to manage the climate change issue. Now, doing that, the global experts, created what they call the just transition. So the just transition is having justice within the energy transition, and that creates inclusivity and participation. As earlier mentioned, the issues of women and other marginalized people in other categories, as she mentioned in Canada, other indigenous. Whenever you speak of marginalization in Africa, it's particularly women, but in other parts of the world, it's also some other indigenous sort of groups. So now, how do we advocate for agricultural practices and technology, for example, to be more climate change cautious? The issues of bilateral and multilateral institutions, government and international donors being able to facilitate issues like crop simulation. We need to change from using crops that are not very cumbersome to climate risk. For example, rice farming. It's in places like Nepal, Thailand, Vietnam. It is not really advocated to do rice farming the way it's done because it causes climate. It's a facilitator of climate change, unlike the farming of potatoes and onions. So we have to be very cautious of what we use in aspects of agriculture, within the energy transition, and in terms of financing as well. We need to have, for example, this transportation of these agricultural products from the agricultural grounds to the markets like in Dar es Salaam. What sort of fossil fuels are used in the transportation? What sort of storage capacity is used? What sort of generation is used? So all these things are very difficult to deal with in terms of, especially the Tanzanian context, because most of these agricultural practices are done by small-scale farmers. So as you try to address the issue of small-scale farmers, you have to understand large-scale farmers are also squeezing them out of the market. You know, and they have the money, they have the power and the global value chain to address climate change issues other than the small-scale farmer. So I just to wind up on my point, I really believe that the issues of climate change and agricultural practices, particularly in Tanzania, need to follow a contextual type of practice rather than a global type of outlook, so that we can be able to incorporate our youth and marginalized communities in agricultural practices up north and everywhere else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That has got my mind rolling, because it's, you know, what comes first. Since yesterday, the issue of context emerged as very key and primary, that we must be aware of our context and what our context demands. Yet you have also presented that we don't live in an island. You may not be able, we are not exporters as such. We mainly import goods and services in the country, but if we are ambitious in our economy to, you know, to grow, we're already a medium income country. To grow from there, Professor is laughing. To grow from there, we also need to look at how we are able to export goods and services. And since we don't live it's a global village. If everybody else is enforcing compliance, climate change regulation compliance, if every other country is emphasizing on that, that means you may not be able to export, for example, the clothes that you're talking about, that are mindful of environment. You know, the production process was mindful of environmental protection. So as much as we want to mind our own context, we are also forced to comply, to be able to exist in this global village. Maybe since you're from the extractive industry, are you aware of the existence in the country right now of practices in the extractive industry in terms of technologies that are being used to address, to be in line with the issue of sustainable climate observation, climate change preservation? Are there any technologies? Are you aware of maybe entities that are doing that? Also, are you aware? I know yesterday Ms. Selina presented on the likelihood of the demand for minerals that are needed to support climate change. How do I say it? We want to preserve the climate, so we in order to develop the renewable resources and, you know, everything that will support that, we also need certain minerals that will support that process. So are you aware, maybe since you're from the extractive industry, are you aware of any efforts or any activities going on in the country right now that are directed towards that route?
Personally, no. I'm not aware of any practices, but I understand the issue of critical minerals that you mentioned with the Kabanga project being the biggest nickel project, I think, in this southern hemisphere. But the practices for smart mining, as you mentioned, to address climate change while you're mining, I'm not aware of any.
Maybe that will come back to the members on the floor. If anyone as a stakeholder is aware of any transitioning that is happening in the market in terms of technology, in terms of smart mining, that will be something that you can contribute and share, because that will help us gauge where we are in terms of addressing sustainable climate change. Addressing climate change. Next, we have Mr. Isakwisa, and you will present to us on improving long-term land tenure security through regulations to address fragmented land rights that contribute to land degradation. Kindly keep it in the context of climate change. I know it is related.
Yes, it is related. Good morning, everyone. And it also relates to what everybody said in the morning, from governance issues to inclusivity to climate change and relationship to agriculture. And all this, again, if you look at it, it affects our land, climate change causes land degradation. If you look about governments, it causes land degradation as well. But going to the theme, which I have to address, we all know, as I explained yesterday, that it is undoubted that our documents, the National Environmental Policy, and many other documents show to us that we have a problem of land degradation. And climate change as well contributes to that as well. But the issue here today is then where is the relationship between land degradation and land tenure security? That is the main issue here, and whether there is a correlation between the two. And this is because when you look at different studies, they prove that there is a correlation, a connection between environmental stewardship and good land tenure security systems, land tenure security. There is a correlation between that. So when you look at Tanzania, in Tanzania, when you look at the land tenure, our land tenure is such that, one, we don't own land, because land is being held by the president in trust of all the citizens. So that's our land tenure system. Of course, we know that the Land Act, the Village Land Act, provided for 3 different uses of land. That is public land, village land, and general land. And when we use this land, we have competing interests in that land. We have people who use that land for agricultural purposes, and they have the rights to use that land for that. We have people who want to use that land for investment purposes. They have a right to use that land for that. We have people who want to use that land for mining purposes. They have a right to use that land for that. People who want to do game hunting. They have a right to do that for that, use land for that. And now we have a fragmentation of laws which all together provide us rights to use land in different ways. Now this brings about the problem of competing interest in the land. So the question is then, how secure is our land tenure system in ensuring that each of these competing interests is well saved? That becomes a question. Now, because we have a fragmentation of land, we have witnessed in the country, and I'll give you a few examples. The Mining Act. The Mining Act provides for measures to rehabilitate land when you're doing foreclosure. And they call for a person who conducts mining activities to save or to deposit what we call an environmental rehabilitation bond. And that again is a requirement of the Environmental Management Act. They say if you're going to do mining activities, then you have to deposit what we call environmental performance bond, so that you conduct environmental stewardship after you finish your mining activities. Now, we've been looking at what's happening within the mining sector. Who then is responsible for ensuring that that activity has been conducted? Is it the people who administer the Environment Management Act, or those who administer the Mining Act? And without clarity on that, we have had mines which have not been foreclosed, and this has led to environmental degradation. We can also have other examples. We have what we call game reserves. For instance, what's happening right now in Ngorongoro. We have people living in Ngorongoro for ages, for a very long time, the Maasai community. But we have an act there which is called the Ngorongoro Conservation Act, which wants to conserve that area. And why do we want to conserve it? Because it's a natural heritage. But again, we're seeing that because of population rise in that area, and the need of the Maasai community to meet other needs within that area is being degraded. So now there are competing interests there. We can come again and look at other examples as well. We have
the Environment Management Act setting a buffer zone of 60 meters, that we shouldn't do any activity within 60 meters from the shore of any river or water body. But we have other sector laws which have provided for other other requirements. For instance, the Water Resources Management Act, I think, provided for 60, and we had other laws which took it to 100 or 200 and extra. And now, because there was this fragmentation of laws, people didn't know really which law to follow. Of course, the minimum was set by the Environment Management Act, but because of that lack of an understanding of what we should do, because of these laws are providing for different dimensions, we have had land which has been degraded and abused because of that clarity. So now, what then should we do? When you look at the definition of land tenure, security, it cannot be a situation whereby a person exclusively owns land, and that right cannot be taken, and it's for an undefined period of time. That's what the definition is. When you look at our national land policy, it tells us that it wants to provide us a secure land tenure. But again, it says that that land doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the state under the president, and it's being held in trust. So it can be taken away, of course, through compensation. But how adequate is that compensation? And again, if you're not going to hold then that land and feel secure with it, then can you be a good environmental steward towards it? These are questions we have to answer. So to conclude, looking at the fragmentation of laws that address land matters in the country, I think there's a need to do a revisit of these laws, so that to harmonize all the land rights and see whether they provide us a secure land tenure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that was very clearly put out. The takeaway being there is a need for harmonization of laws. And that will be a key step, I think, as we work towards having the national climate change policy when it comes to that area, specific area of land degradation and environmental preservation. Now on to you, John. You're also to speak about ESG considerations. Were you prepared for that, or did you have something else? Okay. Please go ahead, so that I don't, in the interest of time, kindly make your presentation in the area. You can also respond to some of the observations made by other panelists.
Thank you. First, in response to my fellow panelists to my left, I think many of us are familiar with the tragedy of the commons, which is something that was studied in the United Kingdom. The common land was used for grazing purposes, and everyone had access to land, but no one had responsibility for the stewardship of the land, which resulted in long-term degradation of that land. And I noticed just recently in my own province, where we've had common grazing lands for cattle, that we've moved away from that system to a system of auctioning leases to cattle producers, so that they'll have the land for a period of 21 years. And then they have responsibility. It is in their own self-interest to maintain the productivity of that grazing land for their cattle. We, in our context in Canada, although the Crown, the government, ultimately is the source of all title to land, there's very much a land ownership system in Quebec, and a civil law system. In the other provinces, a common law title system, a modified torrent system that came out of Australia originally, where title to land is issued and title is guaranteed by the government, and that security of tenure is there. And in terms of the resource sectors, land tenure is different, because most of the development occurs in unoccupied territory, because the spaces in Canada are very vast.
All of that's important because it provides security for the company, it provides security for the company's investors and lenders. And compensation, whereas for businesses, you're compensated based on a market value approach if land is taken. If you are a farmer or if you have your home taken, your compensation could be significantly more because what you are paid is not the value of your land and your home or your farm. It's actually the cost of reestablishing you in a similar home or similar farm in another location, which can be many, many times the cost, the value of the land. If something can be found, like so, if someone has a home next to some water and has fruit trees in it, then your compensation is based on the value of replacing that, not being relocated somewhere far from water with no trees. But I digress. Picking up on some of the points that Selena said and that others have said, corporations in ESG are looking at it from a global supply chain perspective. And investors are looking at it from a global supply chain perspective. So if I'm a producer of Apple iPhones, investors are wanting to know where I source my raw materials from. Where does my lithium come from, the lithium battery? Where does the cobalt come from? How is it produced? How much energy is used to produce it? And investment decisions are starting to be made on those kinds of bases. There are purchasers of these raw materials and intermediate products who are becoming very interested in the sourcing of those products for purposes of reporting and for purposes of consumer demand as well. Now, your average 22-year-old is not going to give up their iPhone even if you tell them that the cobalt is coming from the DRC and it's being mined in terrible conditions. But they are certainly protesting on the streets or campaigning to make sure that that's not occurring. There's some hypocrisy there, but that's the way of the world, and maybe more so among 22-year-olds, I don't know. People want what they have and don't want to give it up, but they also want to be seen to be doing the right thing. And this doing the right thing, which is good for the environment and good for the world and good for the economy globally, is what is driving this move towards ESG. ESG is, as Celia says, different than corporate social responsibility in some respects. I remember when corporate social responsibility was just coming out as something relatively new. The venerable magazine, The Economist, had a 16-page center spread editorial supplement saying that a rational investor should not be concerned about ESG, and that the Adam Smith is for corporate social responsibility, and that the purpose of a corporation was to maximize returns for its investors and not to be doing good in the community, and that the invisible hand of Adam Smith should prevail. While the world has changed, and I think the Economist must have had to eat a lot of crow since those articles were published, because environmental responsibility is super important. So we think of mineral and oil and gas as fungible commodities. You know, there's cobalt, there's lithium, there's lithium. There is oil is oil. And to some purchasers of these commodities, that's absolutely correct. They don't really care where the product comes from, how it is produced. As long as it's a secure supply at a competitive price, that's their only concern. But in the global supply chain context, that's becoming less and less the case, particularly as businesses who compete for customers, who compete for investors, who compete for lenders, have to demonstrate to these groups that their product is responsibly produced, that
the components that go into the product are responsibly sourced. And so, you know, you think of conflict diamonds in West Africa. There was a worldwide movement to try to avoid and identify conflict diamonds, driving down the price of those products and driving down the revenue to those who are producing it in areas of conflicts. The same sort of thing is being applied to other commodities. We have mining companies now in my province who are, and oil and gas companies in Canada, who are looking to differentiate their otherwise fungible product by the way it is produced. We have a lithium company in my province who is looking to brand itself as the first net zero emissions lithium mine in the world. Because the controversy that is there is that by the time you produce your Tesla vehicle, the carbon footprint of producing a Tesla vehicle and all the batteries that go into it is greater than the greenhouse gas emissions that you're going to reduce over the life of driving that vehicle as compared to driving a traditional gas-powered vehicle. Now, I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that's certainly some of the perception out there. So you have one of our provinces, Alberta. Oil production is primarily through the in-situ mining of oil sands, which is very energy intensive because the petroleum product is like tar that's bound into sand and can only be extracted through the use of solvents or heat. Or if it's close to the surface, it can be open pit mined, and it has to be extracted using steam from the tarry product to make bitumen that can be put down the pipeline to go to a refinery or refined closer by. The province of Alberta has a population of about 2.5 million people in Canada, yet that province, out of our 39 million people, produces 40% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions, mostly because of that activity. It's trying to rebrand itself, though, through other means to say that we're changing that. We're going to sequester carbon, we're going to reduce the emissions in processing that oil, and plus we have high standards of environmental protection, that we have high standards of employee safety, we have good working conditions, we have high wages. And all of those things are going to be factored into deciding what raw materials are being produced in a socially responsible manner. Just a last closing point. Madam at the second table for me toward the front made the point about using renewable energy and whether it's practical or not. You know, my province is very fortunate. 99% of our electricity comes from hydroelectricity, which is renewable. Other provinces in Canada don't have that luxury. So it would be very easy for that mining company to have a net zero footprint, especially if it uses electric vehicles in its operations. Just received an email this morning saying that in mining, 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions are from the operation of diesel-powered machinery and equipment at the mine, large vehicles. And so there's a presentation in 2 weeks at my local Prospectors and Developers Association from Sandvik about the switch to electric vehicles, large electric vehicles in mining operations to reduce the greenhouse gas footprint. But where does the electricity come from to charge those vehicles? If you're in a remote location and if you run diesel generators to generate your electricity to charge your electric vehicles, what is the point? You gain nothing. Can you get a large enough solar array to charge those vehicles? If you're fortunate enough to have hydroelectricity, then you know, praise to God that you've got that blessing, and you can do that and create a net savings. But that's not open to every operation. You have to look at it in a large context as to what makes sense, and that applies on a national level too. When you have such a low carbon footprint, even 1 or 2 large-scale projects could double the national output in greenhouse gases, but you're not going to stifle your development just to maintain a number. You have to look at it in an overall context and do what you can to do the best you can, but not at the same time lose all your opportunity.
Wow, thank you very much. That was very complex, with very complex examples of how the advancement of technology can also lead to emission of greenhouse gases and environment degradation and hence climate change. But back to the floor now, members of the floor. I know this has gone on for an hour and maybe you probably think it's too complex and high level, but to break it down and bring it back to you. ESG, the new corporate social responsibility. How do we see it? What can we say about it in terms of sustainable, in terms of climate change? Is it there? Are we doing it? Are we seeing it? Do we want to see it happening, especially in the extractive industry? Inclusion of women, as Professor had discussed it, it is there. It has to be contextual. What is your take? The issue of transitioning to technologies that can come back to us at at workplaces maybe, and from our experience, I'm not seeing the members who are doing case management in Gaeta, but do we have complaints from grassroots communities in terms of the new technologies that are probably being deployed in the mining areas, and how is it affecting the communities there? What do we want done in terms of climate preservation, addressing climate change? And then the issue of land tenure security and environmental stewardship, bringing it down to our level. What is our take? He has raised key pertinent issues in terms of the land tenure in Tanzania. What is your own experience? How does the land tenure, for example, with the land that you own, some of us maybe own hectares of land which has trees. There comes a time that you have to do you mine them? Do you unavuna ile miti? What is your take? We need to look at all these and contribute from our very, very personal experience and what we want to do in terms of addressing climate change. Can I have anyone responding in the room? So far, responding to the discussion.
Thank you, everyone, for that very interesting panel. I just wanted to mainly ask a question, as Sarah had asked, about transitioning to new technologies, because we have some people from Gaeta Gold initially in the room, and I went on the website to see if there's any mention of climate transitioning or any kind of actions being taken by GGM, and I don't find anything on their website. So I just wanted to see if there was any thoughts coming out of the proponent in the room on that, and also on the land tenure issue about carbon sinks that have been mentioned, tree planting, and trying to pivot to transition to climate-friendly agriculture and other incentives. Is the government of Tanzania thinking about incentives to land use, on how farmers, especially women, we have to say that in Canada, how they can become stewards of change in using the land for carbon sinks? For example, in Italy, when I was married to an Italian, there was a lot of incentives from the Italian government to plant trees, and you would be paid for pulling out your tomato plants and instead planting trees, or pulling out your artichoke and having 3 hectares of solar panels. So those kinds of incentives were used in Europe and even years ago to add to reforestation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for the questions. Elizabeth is not here, but when she's in, we will have a response to that. There's another question on, would you like to respond? Maybe we can take one more question from here so that we have 3 questions.
Asante. Nawashukuru watu wa mada wote kwa mada nzuri ambazo zimezidi kutupatia mawazo katika mada tunayojadili. Nina swali moja kwa profesa. Kwenye mada yake inayohusu namna mifumo ya utawala inavyotakiwa kusaidia katika kuongeza ushiriki wa wanawake kwenye vyombo vya maamuzi. Ametueleza masuala mengi kwamba mifumo ipo, serikali kuu, serikali za mitaa mpaka ngazi za vijiji na mitaa hadi ngazi ya nyumba. Na akatuambia kwamba muhimu ni kuzingatia ile misingi ya utawala bora. Lakini katika jambo la msisitizo alitoa akatuambia tuna sheria nyingi zipo ambazo zinaeleza ushiriki au zinaweka masharti ya ushiriki wa wanawake katika ngazi za maamuzi. Mojawapo ya mfano wake aliyotolea ni sheria ya vijiji namba 5 ya 99 kwamba imeweka idadi kwenye baraza la kijiji kwamba wanawake wanatakiwa wawe. Lakini akashauri kwamba hiyo mifumo tunavyoianzisha tuzingatie mila na desturi za maeneo husika, na akatolea mfano kwamba kwenye mikoa ya Pwani inaonekana sheria hiyo utendaji wake una shida. Na swali langu kwake, kama tukipata fursa ya kutaka kufanya marekebisho ya sheria ya vijiji kwa maana ya ushiriki wa wanawake kwenye ngazi za maamuzi, nini ushauri wake hasa kwenye maeneo ya Pwani, kwa sababu ile sheria imetungwa kukava nchi nzima? Je, tunaweza tukawa na mfumo wa kuweka utofauti kwenye baadhi ya maeneo kwa kuzingatia mila na desturi zao?
Asante. Naomba tuwe na maswali kama 5 hivi. Tunayo 3 ili tukirudi kule kwa sababu tuko nje ya muda tuwe tunamaliza. Asante.
Mimi la kwangu sijui kama ni swali lakini litaeleweka nikilizungumza. I have been hearing the issue of considering our local contents whenever we are planning, whenever we are doing things. Lakini swali langu ni hivi, hatuoni kwamba inawezekana kuna vitu vingine ambavyo sio content ya Kitanzania lakini vinafanya vizuri sana kule nje? Hatuoni pia tunapozungumzia local content tufikirie pia kuboro vile vizuri ambavyo wenzetu wanavyo ili kuweza kuviapply hapa baada ya kufanya upembuzi yakinifu wa kina kwamba viko applicable? Sababu tukiangalia tu hapa kwetu, na tumeshasema sisi ni global village, ninahisi kama tunaweza tukafika mahali tukabaki tu na local content za kwetu tukakwama. Nadhani profesa atanijibu, haoni kwamba kuna haja ya yale mazuri yaliyoko kule nje na hasa mambo ya teknoloji na vitu vingine tukaviazima pia tukaunganisha na hii local content? Ninaamini kwangu vinaweza vikafanya kazi vizuri zaidi, lakini kwa uzoefu wako profesa unaweza ukanisaidia hilo.
Ninachokisikia ni kwamba wanasema tusijibane sana, tujaribu kukua na kuendana na kasi ya wakati. Kuna kaukweli kwa sababu generation ya wanawake wa level yako Madam Pauline na ya kwangu na ya watoto wangu na watoto wa kike ni tofauti kwenye uelewa na jinsi wanavyopokea vitu. Hao wadogo wanapokea haraka sana, na sisi tuko katikati kidogo, we are a little bit flexible. Nyinyi kidogo mko rigid, I could say that. Kwa hiyo the question is to you professor, nadhani iko clear. Can we yes.
Hapo endelea na ile swali mpaka waliongezea walikoeleza hivyo. Nikugusa. Sasa mimi pia naungana wengine kushukuru kwa jinsi ambavyo tumepata elimu hii asubuhi, na kwa kweli ni nzuri sana, inazidi kuchangia tunapotaka kwenda kama sehemu ya mradi huu. Tangu jana sikia kwanza Tanzania kutokuwa na sera. Ni sawa kwamba hatuna sera ya climate change, lakini nafahamu kwamba tumekuwa na mkakati tangu miaka hiyo, na sasa hivi tunayo hiyo National Climate Change Response Strategy ambayo inaisha mwaka 2026. Sasa sijaona popote ambapo kutekeleza hii ni kikwazo kwa sababu hatuna sera basi haitekelezeki. Sijaona maandishi yote yananiambia kwamba kutokuwa na sera ya taifa basi mkakati huu umeshindwa kufanikisha. Na mimi nafahamu kwamba unaunda sera kwanza, alafu unaunda mkakati. Sasa mkakati tayari upo. Kwa hiyo kama mkakati upo, nataka tuko hatua moja mbele. Kwa hiyo ningependa kusikia kutoka kwenye panel kama walipata nafasi kwa mkakati huo, tuambie kwenye mkakati huo, je, ushiriki wa wanawake kwenye mkakati huo, ushaji katika sekta ya madini unatutosha sisi kuutumia, au kuna haja ya advocate kwa ajili ya kufanya uweze kuwa inclusive zaidi, labda tunapozidi kwenye mbele safari, au tufanye nini? Kwa sababu kama upo tayari, basi itakuwa shida tu ni namna gani kupeleka kwa wananchi, kufanya uwe rahisi wananchi washiriki, tuweze kwenda nao pamoja.
Thank you. Karibu. That was the first question.
Asante sana. Na mimi nawashukuru wawasilishaji wote. Maeneo mawili tu niliyokuwa naomba ufafanuzi kidogo. Kwanza kwa profesa, hii ya participation ya women katika decision making processes. Je, kwa kiwango gani imekuwa na athari katika kuhakikisha kwamba ushiriki wa wanawake unaonekana? Yaani nakusudia kwamba tunaona hivi sasa ziko juhudi za kuhakikisha kwamba wanawake wanashiriki katika vyombo vya kufanya maamuzi. Kwa mfano hata tukianzia ngazi ya juu kwenye mabunge yetu haya, tunajua kwamba kuna upendeleo wa wanawake wa viti maalum. Kama hapa nasema 30% ya viti vya bunge vitakuwa kwa wanawake. 30% ni asilimia kubwa. Na kwa Zanzibar najua wao katiba inasema ni 40%. Yani tayari 40% ya wabunge wawakilishi pale ni moja kwa moja ni wanawake. Kwa hivyo wana participate. Swali langu, je, ile imekuwa na impact, imeathiri kuhakikisha kwamba yale majukumu na haki na wajibu wa wanawake katika kusaidia mambo haya imekuwa na impact, au pengine wapo tu kwa sababu wameshiriki na tumebaki kwamba kumekuwa na participation? Lakini je, kuna ile ukiacha ile quantity kwamba na wao wameingia, lakini kuna quality participation pale, kwamba kuna athari imeonekana kwa sababu ya ushiriki uliopiganiwa hapo? Hiyo nilikuwa naomba ufafanuzi tu, kama experience yetu imeonyesha vipi, impact gani ipo, wale walioingia kwa viti vile wamekuwa mule na utetezi gani katika maeneo ambayo ndio constituency yao ambayo imewapeleka pale. Nafikiri limeeleweka hilo.
Ndio, umeeleweka.
Kuhusu la ardhi, mimi nilikuwa naomba ufafanuzi. Kuna tatizo gani kwamba ile stewardship tuliyozungumzia ya kwamba ardhi, kwa sababu mfano najua hapa kuna ile right of occupancy, pengine inaweza ikaonekana kama kwamba iko tofauti kidogo na ile freehold per se, lakini ukiacha hizo theories na hata ile hofu kwamba ultimately land owner ni serikali, kwa sababu sisi hatuna ile ownership right as such, lakini naiona kama ni hypothetical tu, kwa sababu hii kwamba land inakuwa owned na head of state is common everywhere almost. Ukiangalia nchi zote ipo hii kwamba ultimately the land is owned by the head of state. Hypothetical, lakini yule ambaye ana occupy na ana benefit na ile land ndiye ambaye ana yale majukumu. Sasa the question is, what is the controversy, au kuna difficulties gani katika ile stewardship katika protection ya au ku enhance zile factors za climate change? Asante sana Nyali.
Asante, I hope Isapisa capture hiyo.
Asante moderator. Nami nilikuwa na hoja chache, lakini moja kabla sijaleta la kwangu, kama itakupendeza moderator. Nadhani profesa ametulia swali kuhusu local content. To be clear, mimi nimekuwa assistant commissioner local content CCR Ministry of Minerals for quite some time. Kwa nadhani kuna mengine kama polisi na nini profesa akinikaribisha naweza nikasaidia pia kutoa elaboration kwa swali la mdau aliyeuliza kuhusu local content. Lakini langu mimi linahusu zaidi ni swali kwa bwana Isakwisa. from Vice President Office. Amezungumza fragmentation of the law, which is very true. Unaona kwamba mambo mengi yanahusiana na protection of the environment actually yapo kwenye sheria za kisekta na pia kwenye sheria ya mazingira. Sasa hii fragmentation unaona hata management, kwa maana environmental management kidogo it becomes a little bit difficult. Na kuna mifano, kwa mfano nitakupa mfano mdogo bwana Isakwisa, lakini pia na waheshimiwa wajumbe. Kuna watu wanaitwa Tanzania Atomic Energy Agency ya Arusha ambao wanasimamia masuala ya mionzi. Kwao wao uranium ni kitu hatari, lakini ukija kwenye Ministry of Minerals kwetu sisi ni resource. Sio kama naeleweka. Sasa wao sheria zao zipo kwenye restriction, more on restrictions, lakini sisi sheria zetu zipo zaidi kwenye namna gani we can recover and harvest that resource. Sasa shida ambayo naiona hiyo fragmentation au proliferation of these laws, legislation or whatever you can call it, or regulations, ni kwamba sijui imeanzia wapi. Napata shida kidogo kwa sababu ni kweli we need to harmonize, lakini somewhere tulifanya makosa, tumetengeneza hizi proliferation of the regulations unnecessarily. Lakini nilitarajia kwamba kabla sijatengenezwa tutengeneze modality ya namna ambavyo hii kitu itashuka labda kuanzia juu kushuka chini. Nilikuwa natarajia kwamba kwa mfano the Environmental Management Act should be the principal law. I'm not a lawyer, labda mtanisaidisha. Lakini from that one sasa unapokuja kwenye hizi sheria za kisekta ndio sasa zina borrow from the Environmental Management Act, lakini it's not the case kwa namna ambavyo uzoefu wangu mdogo kisheria unavyoonyesha. Sasa swali linakuja, Vice President Office ambayo ni higher authority inapokuja kwenye masuala ya mazingira, kwa sababu the way you presented it is like also na wewe pia mnalalamika, wakati nilitarajia nyinyi ndio muwe viongozi na msimamie kuhakikisha kwamba swala hili linarekebishwa, kwa maana synchronization na hiyo harmonization of the law. Sasa swali langu, labda Vice President Office ina mikakati gani kuhakikisha kwamba haya matatizo ya fragmentation pamoja na proliferation of the laws and regulations yanakuwa addressed nchini ili kuondoa mikanganyiko specifically kwenye masuala yanayohusu environmental management?
Asante sana. Last, please stick to your question. Don't comment, sir. We are really out of time.
Okay. Hello everyone. Mimi personally sidhani kama inaweza ikawa ni posting per se, lakini ni kulingana na Jimmy alivyo comment pamoja na mdau kutoka wizarani. Tukiangalia the strategy, hiyo climatic change strategy ambayo ipo ya mwaka 2012 ambayo ni ya mpaka 2026, imeelezea, imestipulate vizuri kwenye kila sekta, lakini when it comes to energy hawaja stipulate anything much. Wakati ukiangalia 4 to 7% ya greenhouse gas emission in the world inatoka kwenye mining activity, sana sana kwenye iron. Lakini bado tunashindwa ku differentiate between environmental impact na climatic impact, sana sana kwenye sekta madini. Kwa hiyo natamani wakati tunaenda kuangalia hii strategic plan, strategic mpango mkakati ambao umewekwa wa climatic change tangu mwaka 2012, tuangalie how to adjust hapo na work vizuri na wizara katika kuweka mambo yakae sawa, kwa sababu we are not tackling the problem that is on the ground. Tunaangalia tu vitu vingine instead of tackling the real problem that is on the ground kwenye sekta ya madini. Asante.
Okay, that's an interesting presentation. May I please invite the panelists to respond to the questions? Try to be really brief and straight to the point because we are really out of time. When I stand up, that means you're really out of time.
Thank you very much. Nitarudia kwenye lugha yetu. Watu wengine mtavaa madude yenu msikilize. I'll start with one general issue kwa ujumla wake. Na hapa nitakuwa mkweli kidogo. Kwenye tasnia ya swala la mazingira kuna mambo mengi sana ambayo yanakuja kwa mkupuo. Hilo la kwanza. Na kabla hujaelewa moja, unakuta jingine limechomekwa au limechomekwa au limechomeka lenyewe. Kwa hiyo mliangalie, hilo ni muhimu sana tunapofanya maamuzi katika tutakapochelewa kufanya kazi. Kwa hiyo hili la CSR ESG hapa nimeweza kuona pia kwamba imekuja kwa mbadala. wengine wanasema hapana. Lakini nadhani hoja sio kwamba ni mbadala, ni kitu ambacho wanasema ni kipya na kinalinganishwa na CSR. Ukisoma kuangalia unaona kama sasa unajiuliza CSR ya kwetu ambayo tuliweka kwenye CSR about corporate social responsibility na environmental social governance. Haya maneno mnachukulia kwa uangalifu. Sisi tumeanza kwenye sera zetu kujaribu kuhakikisha kwamba wananchi kwenye maeneo ambayo yana changamoto ya uwekezaji wanufaike wao kwanza. Na imekuwa ni kilio kwa muda mrefu. Sasa hili linakuja inasema tuangalie chanzo. Twende DRC, tuangalie kule. Tunataka kukwepa majukumu yaliyopo. Hatujaifanya vizuri na tulipotaka kuliweka kwenye sheria itakuwa kidogo kweli. Sisi wengine tulihusika katika kuandika sheria hizi. Kwenye swala la local content ilikuwa ni changamoto kubwa kutoka kwa wawekezaji. Wengine wakadiki kusema kwamba itakuwa ni mara ya kwanza inafanyika katika nchi duniani ndani kwenye sheria. Tukasema haina shida tukiwa wa kwanza, kwa sababu tunafahamu changamoto. Sasa hapo pia naona mtuuliza na pia tajibu. Kinachotokeza hapa pia tunachanganya, nimezungumzia local context. Na kuna tofauti ya local context na local content. Uhalisia. Unapozungumzia local context, nazungumzia, nitarudia kwenye swali la msingi nililoulizwa hapo, kwamba kwa sasa hivi kwa nini tusiwe dunia kwenye meza ya diwani, mheshimiwa diwani aliuliza ni kwamba sasa hii na akasisitiza mwezeshaji sio mwekezaji, mwezeshaji akasisitiza hili la msingi. Nakubali ni swala la msingi. Tunachosema ni dunia ni dogo. Udogo wake usije kutumeza sisi. Tuna mila na desturi zetu, tuna tamaduni zetu, tuna uchumi wetu ambao ni tofauti na historia. Kwa hiyo vingine tuvichukue na kwa ujumla wake nakubali ni swala zuri. Tusiwe kwenye kisiwa, lakini tuwe makini. Nitakupeni mfano. Hapa sasa hivi tukiongea ukweli, tutaulizana baadaye kama watoto wetu. Mimi nimetembea kidogo, nilikwenda kwenye viwanja vya ndege vingine, nikuta wamechora mwanamke, mwanamume, alafu wameandika wengineo. Sasa katika muktadha huo nataka kuambia nini? Dunia ni ndogo. Dunia ni kijiji. Tuige bila kuangalia. Kwa hiyo tuwe makini kwenye baadhi ya vitu. Ukienda hivyo, mimi sina shida, mnalielewa. Lakini ukienda huko kijijini, unaongea na wale wazee wetu. Unawaambia sasa sisi tunataka kwenda hivi. Unategemea nini? Kwa utavuruga kila kitu. Ni vizuri uende polepole, uelewa ni mzuri. Unaelewesha, unakubali, unasema haya ni kwetu. Haya mengine aliulizwa Kikwete kukifanya. Sasa haya yakija sisi hatutokuwepo. Heleza kaja lakini hatutokuwepo. Kwa hiyo tuangalie na sisi wenyewe. Tunasoma ndio hicho. Kingine fungo, swali la kuongezeka kwa wanawake kwenye ni kwamba inafanyika, lakini hatuoni wamefanya nini. Kwamba sheria inaweza kubadilika, tufanye nini kubadilisha sheria ili kwa mfano kwenye sheria ya ardhi ya vijiji, namalizia ardhi ya vijiji tuweze kubadilisha. Cha msingi kabla tulichoona mimi ni kwamba hatukuwashirikisha wakafanya maamuzi yao. Tungewashirikisha na haina shida tunapotunga sheria kwamba sheria hii itatumika huku, sheria nyingine itumike ni sawa kabisa. Application laws can be sectoral, can be regional, can be distinct. Sio lazima useme sheria fulani inatumika kila mahali, hapana. Hata katika nchi ya Tanzania bara na Zanzibar. Haraka kwa ya ndugu Awadhi ni kweli hajafanyika utafiti kwamba kuongeza idadi ya jamaa na wanawake kwenye mifumo hii imeongezeka, lakini nadhani kuna kuna kitu kinasaidia kidogo. Tuna baadhi ya watu wanaona kwamba kweli imetokea, na ukiangalia kwa kiasi fulani imetoa chachu. Vijana, mabinti wanaanza kuona kwamba inawezekana, kwa kuona kwamba nao wametokea, na tusiwashushe kidogo. Kuna baadhi ya taasisi na unavuka taula TAMWA kwenye sheria za ardhi, kama isikie nguvu yao. Sheria ya ardhi inazungumzia masuala ya uwezekano wa kutokwenda kukopa kwa kutumia hati, hapo nakwambia lazima mwenza ajue. Hiyo ilitoka kwa kina dada, kwa kina mama, na ilikuwa ni nguvu ambayo ilitoka tangu bungeni. Wao unaona kabisa uwezekano kubwa wa kufanya mabadiliko tofauti. Ndio mfano mwingine kidogo, ukiangalia kwa mfano Kenya wenzetu hawapo hapa leo, lakini kule bunge kupitisha sheria kuwaruhusu kwa kijumla, kuruhusu wanaume kuwa na wake wawili bungeni. Wanawake pinga lakini walikuwa chache. Lakini kuna baadhi ya wanawake baada ya hapo wakajaribu kupinga hicho, nasema sheria ipitishwe na bunge. Mimi nadhani ingekuwepo idadi ya wanawake kwa zidi wanaume Kenya isingepita. Kwa kuna mambo kama hayo ambayo yanajitokeza. Haya mengine ni vigumu kwa sababu ya wakati, labda ukiniambia naendelea, lakini ningependa tu kuonya hicho. Tunachotaka kufanya ni kizuri, twende pole, twende kwa utaratibu na uangalifu. Tukifanya kosa kule kijijini na katika tunapoishi Afrika nzima, 80% ya wananchi wa nchi zetu za Afrika wanaishi vijijini. Ni mila, desturi na kila kitu. Ukivuka kule hata ni yako kama ni nzuri, hautaeleweka. Watu twende kidogo, vijana tunasema mdogo, twende mdogo, tujenge uelewa. Zile mila ambazo sio nzuri, nakubali, unazizungumzia taratibu, unapata unajenga uelewa kwa watoto wa kiume, watoto wa kike, wazee, na unatumia watu wanaofahamika kwenye jamii hizo. Ukichukua NGOs zilizopo Dar es Salaam zile kufika sehemu, akina Waresma, kule wameshakuelewa Geita. Sasa ukianza kwenda eneo lingine kwenye masuala ya climate change, tabia nchi, ukienda na mwelekeo wa Geita, utashindwa kuintegrate. Hawatakuelewa. Kwa hiyo tujifunze na hayo pia. Mimi naomba nimalize kwa sasa hivi. Au mengine nadhani watachangia. Nadhani local context. Changamoto ilikuwa ni nilikuwa nazungumzia local context. Nashukuru.
Thank you, Professor. I think there are a couple of questions that you're going to respond.
Thank you. First of all, the issue of time, I'll just touch on 3 aspects. And number one that is very important, unfortunately I missed yesterday's session, was he mentioned the issue of critical minerals. And critical minerals are very critical, but as they are critical minerals. But the main issue with critical minerals is that with all these things of climate change and sustainability and all the fancy words that surround climate change, the main issue that all of us forget is the aspect of time. Through the Paris Agreement, whether you like it or not, by 2050, we must phase out fossil fuels. This is 2022. So that leaves us with 2 decades or so. In 2 decades, Tanzania is planning to start its investments in LNG. The construction, everything itself will take up almost a decade. By the time we start exporting to these markets, you're remaining with 1 decade. And then, mind you, if in that last decade, whether these markets even need your LNG in the first place, that's another problem. So now when it comes to critical minerals, the same issue comes with Tesla when it invested in Congo through a conglomerate of other companies. And in Congo, there's massive human rights abuse and environmental degradation. Everything that's bad with mining is there. But the issue is that Elon Musk needs the cobalt for his cars. And remember, there's an issue of time. In the UK, they passed a law that by 2030, all cars must run on electricity, renewables. So that means Elon Musk needs to sell all the Teslas before 2030. That gives him 8 years. In 8 years, we are just having this conversation, not implementing anything. So that already leaves us behind, you know. So now, when it comes to critical minerals, what companies decided is, instead of sourcing from Congo and addressing all the issues in Congo, why shouldn't we go and source these minerals from elsewhere, like Morocco, increase more exportation from Canada, increase exportation from Australia? That is good, but where does it leave the Congolese now? It's good for the industry, bad for the Congolese. So that is my issue on critical minerals. It's a very tough situation, as Professor Majaba mentioned. When you touch on this issue, you create another issue. So that was what I don't know, critical minerals. Now, the issue of local content. I actually wrote a book on local content in Tanzania and in East Africa. And I'm totally against local content. Local content does not work anywhere. It's like these things we mentioned here. It's very beautiful when we talk about it, but it doesn't work on the ground. Because the issues of local content, regardless of the laws and the policies, are only three. Can the local person supply at the right time, right quality, and the right price? And those are three things that we know we cannot do in Tanzania. We don't have the right quality, and we cannot do the timeless delivery of whatever it is. You know, so that is a very huge competition. So you can create all these laws, and in countries like Norway, with the stewards of local content and the creators of local content in the world, and in places like Trinidad and Tobago, the way they address local content is very different from the way we address local content. They address local content from a supplier perspective, to have suppliers. You know, we are addressing local content from an employment perspective. That is very different, and it's because by the time, as we mentioned, oil and gas is phasing out. By the time you train, I stayed in university for 14 years to be a doctor. By the time you train somebody else to be a doctor for 14 years, you're already facing 2050. So that person will be out of a job in his 40s. So how does local content apply? So now, my last issue was on the beautiful lady here. She mentioned on the government efforts on farming. And the main issue of us is trying to export. We just started exporting. We export flowers, we export avocados to South Africa now. And there is a project in Usambara called Friends of Usambara. And they realized that due to the steep nature of the farms, whenever it was the rainy season, they couldn't farm, and so hence they couldn't harvest. So now they started, the government and Friends of Usambara as an NGO, they started putting terraces whereby they could control the water movement as well as facilitate efficient smart farming for the people of Usambara. And in the last 10 years, they've been able to produce food for the people and food for exportation to other markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a specialist in the area of local content in here, and we could hold another panel. And you two will debate till tomorrow, you know, one against the other, that it works, it doesn't work. I've seen it working from my own experience as a lawyer. I also understand that there is the supplier aspect in the local content in Tanzania. I have seen people being so much empowered in exploiting these opportunities in the extractive industries when it comes to the local content. And you really have to empower yourselves, you know, as much as we are playing catch up, but we also need, you know, to be able to be in a place in the world where ultimately we hold something and we can say something from experience. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's my opinion. We'll look for that book and read your opinion on the subject. Mr. Isakwisa, two issues. Land tenure for Mr. Awaz and the issue of law fragmentation. I think those are the two issues that were addressed to you, please. If you can do it in 3 minutes, please.
It's all right, I think I have 4.
Okay, 30 seconds for each.
Okay, I'll try my best. There was a question on incentives. whether we do have incentives for people who want to invest in probably climate technologies and things of the like. Our legal instruments do provide for that, but I think the problem comes in terms of implementation. To what extent can we implement that, and to what extent do people know and do people try to access that? And I think most of the incentives probably are on importation point of view and investment point of view. That's where we probably get tax reliefs or things like that. However, if you're to do a project like how you're doing in Italy, you're planting trees, clearing your land, and probably the government has to pay you for that. We don't have that kind of incentive in Tanzania. There was another question on the climate change policy and its implementation strategy, and whether this also covers covers matters within the mining sector. In essence, we don't have a climate change policy, and when we did the assessment, or before we came up with the new environment policy, there was a gap which was noted, and the gap was the gap is that we discovered that we created a law which required sectors to integrate climate change matters into their policies, actions, and plans. However, we lacked a framework policy to show how that can be done, and that's where the gap was. So to fill that gap, that's why the current environment policy requires us to come up with what we call a framework climate policy, because now that will be able to address sector-specific needs and actions directly, rather than how it is right now. Another question was related to what we have right now in terms of the land tenure system. That we have what we call a leasehold system as opposed to a freehold system. And the gentleman made a comment that this is probably just a matter of theory, a hypothetical issue, because at the end of it all, we still use that land in a manner we want. However, there is a difference. The difference is when you talk about a secure land tenure system to how it is defined within the international context. It talks about a system whereby there's predictability of the ownership of that land. However, here you can only be given lease land for 33 to about 99 years. So, and all that land could be acquired at the will of the president for any other purposes. So you can revoke your right of occupancy. So in that way, you don't have that security in the right sense. It is not there, because it could be taken back anytime. So yes, we can hold land, and make people hold land and pass it to one generation to another. That can happen, but at one point in time, that land can be taken away from you. But when you further talk about security, even if the land is to be taken away from you in terms of investment, how is that being done? How is the process of getting that land? The process of compensating you for that land, is it adequate enough? Because we have projects here, people come to invest in certain areas, especially within the villages, and a huge chunk of land has to be taken away from the villagers, and they are promised a lot of things and compensation, but that hasn't been happening. So we want to have a tenure, a system which will be able to go and address such nitty-gritty to this length, that even though you'll be losing your land, in what manner you have to lose that land, how that process can be done, how you can be involved and participate in that process, and ensure that you'll be adequately compensated or relocated elsewhere. Then we had a question about the fragmentation of laws. When we came up with the Environment Management Act in 2004,
we were coming from a system whereby environmental matters were being addressed within the sectors, though we had an environment management law of 1984. But it was not adequately addressing environmental issues. Now, there was a debate as to whether we should come up with one standing law which will address all environmental issues, or we should go with a framework law which will have one principal law that will provide the basic principles of environment management and what should be done, and allocates environmental function to specific sectors. Now, wisdom was used looking into what the system of governance that we have in a country, and it was decided that it is best for us to have a framework law. Now, we have, and the reason for that was because these sectors, they have specific sectoral issues within the sectors. And if you have a standalone law, sometimes you might be inhibiting that sector to really perform because you really want to protect that environment. So we wanted the sectors to self-regulate themselves so that they can provide that balance of, managing the sector, but also taking care of environmental issues while we have an overseer of that. So, of course, in terms of implementation, we have noticed that we have the problem of coordination, and now that brings the problem of the results, that probably will not get the results we want, but that's a part of strengthening the governance and the coordination so that we can work well between the central government and within the Vice President Office, which of course is the overseer and coordinator of the Environment Management Act, with the sectors, which again, they are the ones who oversee and implement environmental actions within the sectors. And I think that was the last one.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much for the responses. I know there are local content champions who would have wanted to also contribute. Mr. Terence, you wanted to say something. But can we please agree to have a 15 minutes, 10 minutes tea break? And when we come back here, we will still have another session, guided plenary session, where we'll have Professor Majamba and Ms. Celine back up there, and they will guide us through the discussion for another maybe 30 minutes before we are able to extract and come up with major strategic issues per breakout group discussions that are indicated in the agenda. We'll see how best we can do that. But what's important right now, thank you very much. A round of applause to the panelists, please. We really appreciate your input. That was a great discussion. Thank you for your time. Karibuni for tea break.